This is a video explanation of the PowerPoint called Integrating Quotations. Let's move on to the first slide. So, you want to use quotations in your essay and later in your research paper from experts and published authors in order to support and illustrate your points. Quotes must be introduced and explained in order for you to integrate them better into your writing. So you don't want to just dump a quote into your paragraphs without giving context for the quote and relating it back to your thesis. A lot of students tend to do that, but you have to make sure that the sentences coming before and after the quote, they introduce and then explain the quote too. So this PowerPoint is going to go over the format for different quotes and then how to explain the quotes in your paragraph. So let's look at the quote we'll be working with. This quote was taken from our book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, from Michael Pollan, and here's the quote itself. The fact is, our food choices are some of the most important choices we get to make in life. The way we eat has a bigger effect on our health and the health of the planet than any other activity. So let's look at some different ways that you can directly quote. Remember, you can use a direct quote, and that means you're taking the exact language from the source and including the author's name and the page number. Now I have a couple of notes for this. So the first time you mention the author's name, Michael Pollan and The Omnivore's Dilemma, the first time you do that, you'll probably do that in your introduction or your first paragraph. You'll want to include the whole name and the title of the book, but later on, you're only going to use the author's last name. So if you say Michael Pollan and Omnivore's Dilemma one time, every time after that you will only use Pollan, his last name. Pollan, 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 Pollan. So these are for introducing a author and source the first time. When you repeat this author or source, just use the last name. So here are different ways you can do it. According to Michael Pollan in Omnivore's Dilemma, direct quote. Then the page number comes after. Michael Pollan in Omnivore's Dilemma suggests that direct quote, then the page number. In Omnivore's Dilemma, Michael Pollan states direct quote, page number. So I used one of those examples right here. According to Michael Pollan in Omnivore's Dilemma, and here is our direct quote. Okay? You'll see that you will end the quote with the quotation marks. Then you will use the parentheses, page number, parentheses, period. Now, if you do not include the author's name in the beginning here, then you will include the author's name at the end, Pollan 4. Another thing to take note of is that you start the quote with a capital letter right here, only if the quote is a complete sentence. So this is a complete sentence, right? Therefore, this first letter will be capitalized. Now, let's look at a blended quote. A direct quote is taking the full, complete sentence from the author, copying the words exactly. A blended quote combines your words and the author's words, and they integrate them smoothly and seamlessly. I really like blended quotes. I think they are a really advanced way to express your opinion alongside the author's. And so let me give you an example. Right here, what we eat might not seem like an important life decision, but some experts would agree that eating has a bigger effect on our health and the health of the planet than any other activity. So you see this part here, this is actually This is kind of my analysis and my paraphrase in my words. And then I take half of Pollen's quote and combine it with my words. That's called a blended quote. I think they're really beautiful. And because I'm not using the full quote, I don't use Pollen's name here and introduce it. I just use his last name and then the page number. And this is MLA. So it'll be a little bit different for your science papers or your psych papers, which uses APA, but you want to use last name, page number. Okay? So in a blended quote, your words come first. Next come the author's words. And note here, this is not a capital letter. This is a lowercase letter because I'm taking a fragment of the author's quote. So it's going to be lowercase. And again, if the author's name is not mentioned before the quote, which is totally okay to do, then you're just going to put his or her last name in the parentheses alongside the page number. Now let's take a look at a summarized quotation. And this is really similar to a paraphrase quotation. I'll explain the difference in a minute. But a summarized quote will rephrase the main idea of the quote in your own words, and you will put the page number at the end because it's coming from a source. It's not coming from you. It's not your analysis or your commentary. It's directly coming from another person. That means you have to give them credit. So here it is. In The Omnivore's Dilemma, Michael Pollan explains the importances of our daily food choices. In fact, he claims that what we eat is one of the most significant decisions we make because our diet has a major effect on our health and the environment. Sorry, that's a spelling error. That should be E, effect as a noun, not as a verb. Anywho, so here you see this is rewritten into my own words. And let's take a look at the difference between the summarized quote and the paraphrase quote. Paraphrase quotes generally maintain the same length as the quote that you are using, and they're shorter and a little broader than a summarized quote. So in The Omnivore's Dilemma, Michael Pollan claims that what we choose to eat is one of the most important decisions in life. Okay, so page number at the end here, no parentheses because we've put it into our own words. And I just want to stress that you don't want to use too many direct quotes in your paper. You want to have variety. Variety is key. So using summarized quotes, blended quotes, paraphrase quotes, direct quotes, you want to use all different kinds of quotes for a more comprehensive paper. Okay, so let's talk about how you want to integrate this quote into a paragraph. Remember, you're not just going to dump it into the paragraph. You're going to first introduce the quote, then quote, then you're going to explain your quote, and then eventually connect it to the thesis. So this is a bit of a formula. You don't always have to follow this formula. Writing is not really formulaic. It's not, there are so many different ways that you can go about doing this, but here is just a general model for a paragraph. So here is a paragraph that I wrote, and you've got your topic sentence here. Corn has negative effects on our health. I give a specific example. First of all, it's a common ingredient in many processed and chemical forms that we consume in our food. I get more specific, and here I used a paraphrased quote from Pollan. Then I go on to talk about something different. So here, let's use this quote down here in this explanation. So, because we consume so many foods with processed corn, Todd Dawson, a biologist at UC Berkeley who has performed studies on the human body by looking at carbon in our cells, says we now look like corn chips with legs. note that I have the quotations and then I have another quotation, the single quotation mark here. This is because I am quoting a quote. So I've got kind of this double quotation thing going when I am quoting a quotation. Okay, so here we have the introduction of the quote, right? Because we consume so many foods with processed corn, then I give information about who said the quote, and then I include this little quote right here. It's a blended quote, okay? And it's paraphrased as well. So I then include an explanation of the quote. In other words, Americans are consuming excessive amounts of corn in their diets. At the end, I tie this evidence back to my thesis, which is corn creates negative effects, and by saying evidence suggests the consumption of processed corn is at the root of many of the health problems Americans suffer today. So here you have it laid out, just like this. I introduced the quote, then I blended the quote, then here I explained the quote, right? In order words. Sorry about that, you guys. It should be in other words. I will change that. In other words, you can also say, this shows, this proves, as one can see. Okay, those are different ways that you can go about explaining. And then the last sentence, in my concluding sentence, I tie back the evidence to the thesis. So you can look this over a little more carefully. Okay, so now that we've talked about how to introduce a quote and how to quote using paraphrases, summaries, blending, or direct quote method, you can practice in the forum and make sure you explain the quote that you choose in the forum and then ask a question about it. All right, let me know if you have questions about this, and I'll see you soon.